Northern California, 1860. A 30-mile valley floor stretches between volcanic mountains. 11,814 acres in one man's hands, 17,962 in another's. 175,000 total controlled by a single Mexican general who divided an empire and gave it away. The brands on their cattle read like Spanish land grants: Rancho Camus, Rancho Carne Humana, Rancho Entre Napa. They did not know they were building the foundation for someone else's fortune. Napa Valley, household name, global brand, legendary. Yes, but the legend does not tell you this. Before the tasting rooms were cattle ranges, before the vineyards were Mexican land grants measuring acreage in square leagues, before the tourism was displacement, drought, debt, depression, deals with San Francisco investors and German immigrants fleeing revolution, a financial panic that killed the cattle trade, capital that bought distressed land at prices the original owners could not refuse. Is Napa Valley a monument to viticultural vision and immigrant entrepreneurship, or an economic machine that survived by becoming whatever each crisis demanded? Which version is the truth? If you enjoy deep dives into how American landscapes transform and who pays the price, please like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments which region's hidden history I should explore next. Chapter 1. The Valley and the Grants. Before wine meant wealth, cattle meant empire. George Calvert, Youant, was born in North Carolina on May 27, 1794. Trapper, hunter, frontier drifter, the kind of man who moved west when civilization caught up. By 1831, he had crossed into Mexican California and found work at Mission San Jose. The work was brutal, the pay was nothing. But Yount had skills the missionaries valued. He could hunt, he could trap, he could work leather and build structures that lasted through winter rains. In 1833, Yount moved north to Sonoma. General Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo controlled everything north of San Francisco Bay. 175,000 acres were distributed to himself and his family when Mexico secularized the missions in 1835. Vallejo was not just a military commander. He was a land baron operating on a scale that made Texas ranchers look modest. His cattle numbered in the tens of thousands. His power extended from the coast to the interior valleys. Yount impressed Vallejo by doing what most Americans could not, making roof shingles. The skill was rare enough in Mexican California that Vallejo took notice. When Yount asked for land in the valley to the east, Vallejo saw opportunity. An American settler loyal to Mexico, willing to occupy territory and develop it, would strengthen Mexican claims against potential American expansion. On March 27, 1836, Yount received Rancho Camus, 11,814 acres. The grant stretched from what is now Yountville north through modern Oakville and Rutherford. Valley floor land, rich alluvial soil deposited over millennia, grass that grew thick in spring, oak trees that provided shade and acorns, the Napa River running through the center, water that never failed even in drought years, land that could support thousands of cattle with minimal investment. Yount built the first log structure in the valley. He planted a small vineyard in 1838 using mission grapes from cuttings Vallejo provided, but the vineyard was secondary, experimental. The real wealth was cattle, hides, and tallow. By the 1840s, California was exporting hundreds of thousands of cow hides annually. Ships from Boston anchored off the coast. Traders paid $2 per hide. The math was simple. A rancher with 1,000 head could generate $2,000 in a single season. In 1845, That was generational wealth. Edward Turner Bale arrived in California in 1837. English, trained as a doctor. He married Maria Ignacia Soberanes, General Vallejo's niece, in November 1841. The marriage made him Mexican by law and opened the door to land ownership. On December 18, 1841, Bale received Rancho Carne Humana, 17,962 acres stretching north from Yount's Grant to what would become Calistoga. The name translates to human flesh. History does not record why Bale chose it. What is recorded is that Bale was difficult, argumentative, fond of liquor. He publicly disputed Vallejo's honesty and was flogged for it. He shot at Vallejo during another dispute and was arrested, but was released when Vallejo declined to press charges. Family connections had value. Bale built more than reputation. In 1846, he completed Bale Grist Mill, a 3-story structure powered by a 36-foot water wheel. The mill processed wheat and grain from ranches across the valley. For decades, it was the economic center of the northern valley. But like Yount, Bale's wealth came from cattle. The mill was infrastructure. The cattle were income. Salvador Vallejo, the general's brother, received Rancho de Napa in 1838, 17,754 acres on the eastern side of the valley. The grant included the small Mexican village of Salvador's Town on the Napa River. By 1840, the valley held multiple massive ranches: Yount, Bale, Salvador Vallejo, and Cayetano Juarez, with Rancho Tulocay's 8,865 acres, and Julian Pope, with Rancho Locoalomi's 8,873 acres in Pope Valley. The valley was not empty. The Wapio people had occupied the land for thousands of years before Spanish colonization. They were hunter-gatherers who managed the landscape through controlled burns and sustainable harvesting. They controlled obsidian mines near Mount St. Helena, giving them trading power across central California. By the 1830s, disease and violence had reduced their numbers. A smallpox epidemic in 1838 killed hundreds. Settlers killed others over cattle theft accusations, real or invented. The land grants ignored indigenous claims entirely. Mexico distributed land as if it had always belonged to them. The rancho economy functioned on a specific model. Cattle grazed freely on unfenced rangeland. Twice a year, vaqueros rounded up the herds for branding and slaughter. The animals were semi-wild, tough, adapted to California's dry summers and wet winters. The Spanish longhorns that dominated California ranching could survive on sparse grass and travel long distances to water. They required almost no investment beyond labor. The labor came from multiple sources: Mexican vaqueros who had learned cattle work at the missions, indigenous workers who had little choice after their traditional economy collapsed, American drifters like Yount, who needed income between trapping seasons. The ranch owners lived well, with adobe houses, imported goods from trading ships, and social events where wealthy Californio families reinforced alliances through marriage and business deals. The system depended on Mexican control of California. That control ended in 1846. The Bear Flag Revolt. American settlers declaring California an independent republic for exactly 25 days before the United States annexed the territory. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 formalized what force had already decided. California became American property. The Mexican land grants were supposed to be honored. They were not. The Land Act of 1851 required all Mexican land grant holders to prove their claims in American courts. The process took years. It required lawyers. It required documents that many ranchos did not possess. It required money that cattle income could not cover when legal fees mounted. Some families lost everything. Others lost portions. Many sold land at distressed prices to American buyers who had the capital to wait out the legal process and the connections to navigate American legal systems. George Yunt died in October 1865 at age 71. He had been the first, the pioneer, the American who proved you could build wealth in the valley. His land passed to his heirs, who promptly began selling it in pieces. The era of the massive cattle rancho was ending, not because the land could not support cattle, because something else was more profitable. Chapter 2. The Experiments. Before wine became an industry, it was a curiosity. Mission grapes had been in California since the Spanish missionaries arrived. Simple, hardy, productive. But the wine they made was unremarkable, suitable for sacramental purposes, not suitable for export or premium pricing. By the 1850s, a few men in California recognized that European wine grapes could thrive in California's Mediterranean climate. The question was where to plant them. Agustin Haraszthy arrived in Wisconsin from Hungary in 1840. By 1849, he was in San Diego. By 1856, he had moved to San Francisco and then to Sonoma County. Haraszthy was not interested in cattle. He was interested in wine. In 1856, he purchased land in Sonoma and founded Buena Vista Winery. He imported European grape varieties: Zinfandel, Tokay, Muscat, varieties that could produce wines that competed with European imports. Charles Krug was born in Prussia on March 1, 1825. He participated in the failed German revolutions of 1848. When the revolutions collapsed, Krug fled to America. He arrived in San Francisco in 1852 and took a job as founding editor of Staatszeitung, the first German-language newspaper on the West Coast. By 1856, he was working as a gold refiner at the San Francisco Mint. By 1858, he was making wine. Krug's first wine work was as a hired winemaker. John Patchett had planted 55 acres of grapes near what is now downtown Napa in 1857. Patchett needed someone who understood fermentation. Krug provided that expertise. He used a cider press to crush the grapes. He experimented with fermentation temperatures. He produced 1,200 gallons of wine in 1858, the first commercial wine production in Napa County. But Krug was working for someone else. In 1859 and 1860, he made wine for other growers. George Yount hired him. Louis Brooke hired him. Krug was learning the land, learning which sites produced better fruit, learning which grape varieties worked in which locations. He was also looking for land of his own. On December 26, 1860, Krug married Carolina Bale. Edward Bale had died in 1848, leaving his family land rich but cash poor. Carolina's mother, Maria Ignacia, controlled the property. The marriage came with a dowry: 540 acres of prime valley floorland north of St. Helena. Krug did not buy the land. He married into it. The distinction matters. The land came with water rights, with established boundaries, with legal title that had survived the Land Act challenges. Krug planted European grape varieties immediately: Riesling, Traminer. By 1861, he had built the valley's first commercial winery: stone walls, redwood fermentation tanks, a cellar dug into the hillside for temperature control. The operation was modest by later standards, 40,000 gallons of production in the first year. But it was permanent, professional, built to last. The timing was crucial. The 1860s were when California's economy was shifting. The gold rush had created instant cities. San Francisco's population had exploded from 800 in 1848 to over 50,000 by 1860. Those people needed food, wine, luxury goods. The cattle trade was profitable, but it was volatile. Hide prices fluctuated. Droughts could kill a season's income. Wine offered something different, a product that increased in value with age, a luxury good that commanded premium prices when made well. By 1865, other men were planting vineyards. Jacob Schramm, another German immigrant, founded Schramsberg on Diamond Mountain in 1862. Thomas Rutherford established vineyards in the area now named for him. H. W. Crabb planted 2 Calonne vineyard in 1868. These men were not ranchers diversifying. They were wine specialists from the beginning. They bought land specifically for viticulture. They studied European techniques. They imported French and German grape varieties. The plantings were small compared to the cattle ranches. 10 acres, 20 acres, 50 at most. But the economics were compelling. An acre of premium wine grapes could generate more revenue than 10 acres of cattle grazing land. Wine required more labor, more expertise, more infrastructure. But for men with capital or access to capital, wine was the future. The cattle ranchers watched. Some experimented with small vineyard plots. Most continued focusing on livestock. The market for beef was reliable, the work was familiar, the investment was minimal. Changing to wine required reimagining everything: how the land was used, how labor was organized, how revenue was generated. Most ranchers were not prepared for that transformation. Then the weather changed. Chapter 3. The Dying. 1862. The rain stopped. California's Mediterranean climate follows a pattern: wet winters, dry summers. The cycles are predictable enough that ranchers plan around them. Cattle fatten on spring grass. They survive summer on stored fat and whatever dry forage remains. Winter rains return. The grass grows back. The cycle continues. 1862 broke the cycle. The winter rains failed. Spring grass never grew thick. Summer came early. By July, the valley floor was brown. Creek beds that normally ran through October were dust by August. Cattle began dying in the pastures. The drought continued through 1863. Through 1864. 3 years without adequate rain. Across California, cattle herds that numbered in the hundreds of thousands were reduced to scattered remnants. Animals too weak to walk to water that no longer existed. Carcasses rotting in fields because there were too many bodies to bury or burn. The scale of loss was catastrophic. In San Luis Obispo County alone, ranchers lost an estimated 80% of their herds. In the Central Valley, entire ranching operations simply walked away from land that could not support livestock without imported feed. And importing feed required capital that most ranchers did not have. The drought did not just kill cattle, it killed the economic model that had sustained California ranching for decades. In Napa Valley, the impact was immediate. Ranchers who had operated on credit found their lenders unwilling to extend new loans secured by dying herds. Ranchers who had borrowed against future hide sales had no hides to sell. The math turned brutal. A rancher might owe $1,000 on land and equipment. His cattle were worth 50 cents each instead of $10. His income collapsed below his debt service costs. Some ranchers tried to drive their herds to still functioning markets, but the cattle were too weak. The drives killed more animals than they saved. Others slaughtered their herds and tried to sell the hides before the leather spoiled, but everyone was selling simultaneously. hide prices collapsed. By 1864, hides that had sold for $2 each were worth 25 cents if you could find a buyer at all. The drought ended in 1865, the rains returned, the grass grew back, but the ranchers were broken. The ones who survived the drought were buried in debt. The ones who did not survive were selling their land at distressed prices to anyone with cash. And then the Depression arrived. September 18th, 1873. J. Cook and Company, one of America's largest investment banks, announced bankruptcy. The bank had financed railroad construction across the northern United States. When those railroads failed to generate expected returns, the bank collapsed. The New York Stock Exchange closed for 10 days. Within months, 55 railroads had failed. 18,000 businesses went bankrupt. Unemployment reached 14% nationally, 25% in New York City. The panic of 1873 triggered what was called the Long Depression. 5 years of economic contraction, falling prices, bank failures, credit that simply disappeared. For California ranchers still recovering from the drought, the Depression was catastrophic. Cattle prices fell again, credit dried up, land values collapsed. In Napa Valley, ranchers who had mortgaged their land to rebuild after the drought faced foreclosure. Banks that held those mortgages did not want cattle ranches. They wanted cash. The land went to auction. Not public auctions with competitive bidding. Quiet sales to buyers with existing relationships to the banks. Sales at prices that reflected the buyer's bargaining power, not the land's actual value. 1874 brought another blow. The California legislature passed the no-fence law. Before 1874, California law had required farmers to fence their crops to keep cattle out. The no-fence law reversed that. Now ranchers had to fence their cattle in. For large cattle operations running thousands of animals across open range, the cost was prohibitive. Miles of fencing, posts, wire, labor to build and maintain it. Ranchers faced a choice: spend money they did not have on fencing, or sell the cattle and quit the business. Many quit. The land that had been cattle country for 40 years was suddenly available. Not at prices the original Mexican land grant families had expected, at prices that reflected desperation, distressed sales, fire sales, bankruptcy sales, land that should have commanded $10 an acre sold for $2, land that should have sold for $5 sold for 50 cents. The men who bought that land were not ranchers, they were investors, merchants, professionals with San Francisco money or East Coast connections. They were not buying cattle ranches, they were buying vineyard sites, because while cattle prices were collapsing, wine prices were rising. Chapter 4. The Brothers and the Capital. Before the empire was wineries, it was German immigration and San Francisco money. Jacob Beringer was born in Mainz, Germany on May 4, 1845. Mainz was wine country, the Rhine Valley, centuries of viticultural tradition. Jacob learned winemaking as an apprentice, cooperage, cellar work, fermentation management. By 1868, he had worked as a winemaker in Berlin and understood the business at every level. His older brother Frederick had already left Germany. Frederick arrived in New York in 1862 and built a malt and barley business. By the late 1860s, Frederick was successful enough to fund expansion. When Jacob arrived in America in 1868, Frederick had capital and connections. Jacob had expertise. Jacob traveled to California in 1870. He did not travel to buy land, he traveled to work. Charles Krug hired him as cellar superintendent. Jacob learned California winemaking by managing Krug's growing operation. He learned which grape varieties worked, which fermentation techniques produced the wines San Francisco buyers wanted, and which infrastructure investments were necessary, and which were wasteful. By 1875, Jacob was ready to operate independently, but operating independently required land and capital. Jacob had neither. Frederick provided both. In September 1875, the brothers purchased 215 acres of land in St. Helena from William and Marie Deguenere for $14,500. That works out to $67.44 per acre. In 1860, that land would have commanded triple that price. In the immediate aftermath of the drought and depression, the Degueners were selling at distressed prices, and the Beringers were buying at a discount that reflected the sellers' desperation, not the land's value. The purchase was strategic. The land adjoined Charles Krug's property, had water rights, established access to the main road, and suitable soil for wine grapes. Most importantly, it was available at a price the Beringers could afford because the previous owners needed cash more than they needed land. Frederick never saw the property before the purchase. He was still in New York running his malt business and operating a wine merchant operation at 180 Fulton Street. He provided the capital from 3,000 miles away based on Jacob's assessment. This was not romantic. It was investment. Frederick was diversifying, putting money into California wine because the numbers worked and because his brother could execute the plan. Jacob began construction immediately. He hired Chinese laborers to dig wine caves into the hillside behind the property. The Chinese workers were available because transcontinental railroad construction had finished in 1869. Thousands of Chinese laborers who had blasted tunnels through the Sierra Nevada were looking for work. Jacob paid them to hand-chisel limestone caves into the hillside. The work took 15 years. The caves extended hundreds of feet into the mountain. The limestone maintained a constant 58 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of outside temperature, perfect for wine aging. The caves were not decorative, they were functional infrastructure that allowed Beringer wines to age properly without the expense of temperature-controlled buildings. In 1876, Beringer Brothers Winery produced its first harvest, 40,000 gallons, all fermented using gravity flow systems that Jacob had learned in Germany. Grapes were crushed on the third floor, must flowed down to fermentation tanks on the second floor, and finished wine flowed down to storage on the ground floor. No pumps were required. Less handling meant less oxidation. Better wine. By 1879, the brothers expanded their vineyard holdings. By 1880, they had installed steam-powered crushing equipment. By 1883, Frederick decided to move from New York to St. Helena permanently. He commissioned a 17-room mansion modeled after the Beringer family home in Mainz, Rhine-House. Built with local stone, it was completed in 1884. The house was not a winery building, it was a statement. German architectural traditions were transplanted to California, displaying wealth through construction. The Beringer operation was successful because it combined German winemaking expertise with American capital access and timing that put them in the market when cattle ranchers were selling. Jacob knew wine, Frederick knew money. The land came from sellers who had run out of options. Charles Krug expanded similarly. By the 1870s, Krug had planted hillside vineyards on Spring Mountain. By 1880, he was developing a 100-acre vineyard near Angwin. His operation was storing over 320,000 gallons of wine by mid-decade. He was shipping to San Francisco and to East Coast markets through the Napa and Sonoma Wine Company, which he helped establish. The pattern repeated across the valley. Wealthy men, often with German winemaking backgrounds and San Francisco or East Coast money, bought land from struggling ranchers. The purchases were legal. The prices reflected market conditions, which in turn reflected a decade of drought and depression that had destroyed the previous owner's ability to negotiate. By 1880, Napa County had 49 registered wineries. By 1891, 166. The valley was transforming at a pace that displaced everything that came before. The cattle ranches were being subdivided and replanted. The Mexican land grant families were selling. The vaqueros and ranch hands were losing employment. The landscape itself was changing as vineyards replaced grazing land, and the people who made it happen were being celebrated as pioneers. Chapter 5. The Mythology. Before the narrative became legend, it was marketing. By the late 1880s, Napa Valley wine was winning awards. In 1887, Beringer wines won their first domestic recognition. In 1889, Beringer's Riesling captured a silver medal at the Paris exhibition. When European wine judges awarded California wines medals, it validated the entire California wine industry. It proved that New World wines could compete with Old World standards. The awards created stories. Charles Krug, the Prussian revolutionary turned wine pioneer. Jacob Beringer, the German craftsman who brought Rhine Valley expertise to California. These were compelling narratives. Immigrants who succeeded through skill and determination. Men who saw opportunity where others saw nothing. The narratives omitted details. They did not mention the land came from distressed Mexican land grant sales. They did not mention the Chinese laborers who hand-carved the infrastructure. They did not mention the drought that killed the cattle industry. They did not mention the depression that made land affordable. They did not mention the no-fence law that finished what drought had started. The omissions were not accidental. Wine marketing required romance. Stories of vision and persistence sold better than stories of economic collapse and opportunistic land acquisition. The valley's transformation was presented as agricultural innovation. The displacement of ranching was presented as progress. The consolidation of land ownership was presented as entrepreneurship. By the 1890s, Napa Valley was producing over 1 million cases of wine annually. The economic transformation was complete. The valley that had been cattle country for 60 years was now wine country. The families who had held Mexican land grants were mostly gone. Some had sold and moved, some had lost land to foreclosure. A few adapted and started their own wine operations. But the ranching economy that had sustained the valley since the 1830s was finished. In 1893, another economic panic struck. Railroads failed, banks collapsed, unemployment spiked. But Napa wine survived better than California cattle had survived the 1870s depression. Wine could be stored. Aged wine increased in value. Wineries with capital reserves could wait out price depressions. Cattle ranchers could not store live animals and wait for better markets. The 1890s also brought phylloxera, a root louse that attacked grapevines. Phylloxera had devastated European vineyards in the 1870s and 1880s. It arrived in California by the late 1880s. By the 1890s, Napa Valley vineyards were dying. Thousands of acres had to be replanted with phylloxera-resistant rootstock. The cost was enormous. Small vineyard owners could not afford it. Larger operations with capital reserves could. The phylloxera crisis accelerated consolidation. Vineyard owners who could not afford to replant sold to operations that could. The pattern from the drought and depression years repeated. Economic crisis, distressed sales, consolidation of ownership into fewer hands. Each crisis eliminated another tier of smaller operators and concentrated ownership among those with access to capital. Prohibition arrived in 1920. The 18th Amendment, the Volstead Act, The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages became illegal. Most Napa wineries shut down. Vineyards were abandoned or replanted to table grapes and raisins. The industry that had taken 30 years to build nearly disappeared in a decade. Beringer survived. They obtained a federal license to produce sacramental wine for churches. The license was rare. It required political connections and legal expertise. Beringer had both. Charles and Bertha Beringer, Jacob's children, managed the operation through prohibition. They produced enough sacramental wine to keep the winery operating and the infrastructure maintained. When Prohibition ended in 1933, Beringer was positioned to restart immediately. Charles Krug Winery did not survive Prohibition intact. The operation shut down, the vineyards were not maintained, the equipment deteriorated. The winery that Charles Krug had founded in 1861 was dormant by the 1930s. In 1943, Cesare Mondavi purchased the inactive winery for $75,000. The Mondavi family had immigrated from Italy. They had operated wine distribution during Prohibition. They had capital and connections. They saw opportunity in Napa Valley's deteriorated wine industry. The purchase price of $75,000 for the oldest winery in Napa Valley reflected post-Prohibition market conditions. Land and wineries were available cheap because the industry had collapsed. The Mondavis, like the Beringers before them, bought at prices that reflected economic crisis, not normal market conditions. The pattern was consistent across generations. Economic crisis, distressed sales, new ownership by those with capital access. Each cycle eliminated previous owners and concentrated control. Each cycle was presented as entrepreneurship rather than opportunistic acquisition during downturns. Chapter 6. The Recovery. Before wine country became tourism, it was reconstruction. The repeal of Prohibition in 1933 did not immediately restore Napa Valley. The vineyards were in poor condition. The equipment was outdated. The market for wine had to be rebuilt from nothing. Americans had spent 13 years drinking illegal spirits and beer. Wine consumption had collapsed. The wineries that survived Prohibition faced a market that barely existed. Beringer pioneered wine tourism. In 1934, they became the first California winery to offer public tours. The caves that Chinese laborers had carved in the 1870s became tourist attractions. Rhine House became a tasting room. The winery's Prohibition survival became a selling point. Visitors could tour a working winery and understand wine production while purchasing bottles to take home. The tourism model worked because it created direct sales that bypassed distribution costs. A bottle sold at the winery netted more profit than a bottle sold through distributors and retailers. Tourism also created brand loyalty. Visitors who toured the winery became customers who requested the brand at stores. The model was so successful that other wineries copied it. But tourism required infrastructure that most wineries did not have. Historic buildings, scenic locations, staff to conduct tours and host tastings, capital to build tasting rooms and parking facilities. The wineries that could afford tourism infrastructure were the ones that had survived Prohibition with capital intact. The smaller operations that had shut down during Prohibition could not afford to restart with tourism models. The Mondavi family rebuilt Charles Krug using different strategies. Robert Mondavi, Cesare's son, understood marketing. He understood that wine was not just agriculture, it was lifestyle. In 1966, Robert left Charles Krug after disputes with his brother Peter and founded Robert Mondavi Winery. The new winery was designed for tourism from the beginning. Mission-style architecture, visitor center, concert lawn. Robert was not just making wine, he was selling Napa Valley as a destination. The Mondavi marketing approach transformed how California wine was sold. Wine became associated with sophistication, European travel, cultural refinement. The marketing rarely mentioned that the land had been cattle ranches, that the wineries had been built by immigrants buying distressed property, that the caves had been carved by Chinese laborers. The story was about vision and quality, and California's Mediterranean climate producing world-class wines. By the 1970s, Napa Valley was producing premium wines that competed internationally. In 1976, the Judgment of Paris shocked the wine world. A blind tasting in Paris, French judges, California wines competing against French wines. Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, Cabernet Sauvignon, won the red wine category. Chateau Montelena Chardonnay won the white wine category. Both wineries were in Napa Valley. The Judgment of Paris validated California wine at the highest level. European wine establishment recognition. It triggered a wave of investment in Napa Valley. Land prices began rising. Vineyard acreage expanded. Corporate investors began purchasing wineries. The cottage industry that had rebuilt after Prohibition was becoming big business. The 1980s brought another phylloxera outbreak. This time, wineries knew how to respond. Replant on resistant rootstock. The cost was enormous, but the knowledge existed. Large operations replanted and survived. Small operations sold to larger ones that could afford replanting costs. The consolidation pattern repeated. By the 1990s, Napa Valley was protected by the Agricultural Preserve, established in 1968. The preserve limited development and protected agricultural land from suburban sprawl. It was celebrated as visionary land use planning. It was also the formalization of wine industry dominance. The valley that had been cattle country until the 1870s was now legally protected as wine country. The transformation was complete. Wine tourism became Napa's largest industry, millions of visitors annually. Wine trains, hot air balloon rides, luxury hotels, Michelin-starred restaurants. The valley marketed itself as California's premier destination. The tourism presented wine production as romantic, harvest season, crush, barrel aging. The work was photogenic. The reality was industrial. Modern Napa wineries are industrial operations, fermentation tanks holding tens of thousands of gallons, bottling lines processing thousands of bottles per hour, distribution networks shipping to every state. The romance is for tourists. The business is agriculture and manufacturing at scale. Chapter 7. The Mansions. Before luxury was infrastructure, it was status. Rhine House was not the first mansion in Napa Valley. The Mexican land-grant families had built substantial homes, but Rhine House represented something different. It was built in 1883 and 1884 when Frederick Beringer decided to relocate from New York to St. Helena permanently. 17 rooms, Victorian architecture, built to German specifications, using local stone and imported materials. The house cost more than the entire vineyard operation had cost 9 years earlier. Rhine House was designed to impress. Multiple parlors, a library with built-in bookshelves, stained glass windows, elaborate woodwork. The rooms were sized for entertaining. The estate had gardens, outbuildings, everything necessary for Frederick to host San Francisco society and East Coast wine buyers in appropriate style. The house served business purposes. Wine buyers visited. Distributors toured the property. Investors assessed the operation. Rhine House demonstrated financial success and permanence. It showed that Beringer Brothers was not a speculative venture. It was an established business run by serious men with capital. But Rheinhaus was also about status. The Beringers were German immigrants who had arrived with skills, but not wealth. Frederick's malt business in New York had generated the capital to buy the Napa property. Within a decade, they had built an operation successful enough to justify a mansion that rivaled anything owned by the old Mexican land grant families. The mansion was proof that the transformation was permanent, that the new owners had replaced the old. Other wine families built similarly. Inglenuk, built by Gustav Niebaum, a Finnish sea captain who had made a fortune in Alaska fur trading. Niebaum purchased land in 1879 and built a stone winery modeled after French chateaux. His estate included imported furnishings, a private tasting room designed like a ship captain's quarters. Everything communicated wealth and permanence. The estates served multiple functions. They were working wineries, but they were also statements. The buildings were constructed from stone and brick, built to last centuries. The wine cellars were carved into hillsides, temperature controlled through natural insulation. The estates demonstrated that wine production required capital investment at scales that casual farmers could not match. The architectural choices were deliberate. European styles: German, French, Italian. The buildings did not reference Mexican California or American Western traditions. They referenced European wine regions. The message was clear. This was not frontier agriculture. This was old-world expertise transplanted to California. The estates also established social hierarchies. Winery owners hosted elaborate events: tastings, dinners, garden parties. The guest lists included San Francisco society, political figures, wine journalists. The events reinforced that wine production was sophisticated, that winery owners were cultured, that Napa Valley was not cattle country anymore. The Mexican land grant families who remained were integrated into this social structure only if they adapted. Families that maintained cattle ranching were excluded. Families that converted to wine were accepted. The social transformation followed the economic transformation. New money replaced old. European wine culture replaced ranching culture. The estates were expensive to maintain. Gardens required gardeners. Houses required domestic staff. The wine operations required seasonal workers for harvest and year-round workers for cellar management. The labor was divided along ethnic lines: Chinese workers in the caves and vineyards, Mexican workers in seasonal harvest, European immigrants in skilled positions. The hierarchies were clear. By the early 1900s, Napa Valley had created a social structure that mirrored European wine regions. Wealthy estate owners at the top, professional winemakers and vineyard managers in skilled positions, seasonal agricultural workers at the bottom. The structure lasted through Prohibition, through phylloxera, through multiple economic depressions. The estates were built to endure. Rheinhaus was opened to tourists in 1934. The private mansion became public space where visitors paid admission to see how wine families lived. The library became a tasting room. The parlors became event spaces. The transformation from private residence to commercial attraction was profitable. Tourists paid premium prices for experiences in historic settings. Modern Napa estates continue the tradition. Wineries build tasting rooms that reference historic architecture: stone walls, imported materials, European design. The buildings are larger and more expensive than their 19th-century predecessors, but the message is the same. Wine production is sophisticated, European-influenced, worthy of premium pricing. The estates also serve marketing functions: wine clubs, private tastings, member-only events. The experiences are carefully curated to emphasize exclusivity and craftsmanship. The history of the estates is presented selectively. The European wine traditions are emphasized. The displaced cattle ranches are not mentioned. The Chinese laborers who built the caves are footnotes. The economic depressions that made the land affordable are omitted. The narrative presented to tourists is one of vision and quality. Pioneers who recognized the valley's potential. Immigrants who brought expertise. Families who built legacies. The narrative is true in limited ways. The pioneers did have vision, the immigrants did bring expertise, the families did build legacies, but the complete story includes economic collapse, distressed land sales, and opportunistic acquisition during crises. That story does not sell wine. Chapter 8. The Disappeared. Before the valley was preserved, it was cleared. By 1890, the Mexican land grant families who had controlled the valley for 50 years were mostly gone. The Bale family sold their land in pieces through the late 1800s. The Vallejo family holdings in Napa were subdivided and sold. The original ranchos existed only as names on historical markers. Rancho Caimus, Rancho Carne Humana, Rancho Entre Napa. The grants measured in square leagues were now vineyard parcels measured in acres. The vaqueros who had worked the cattle ranches found limited employment in wine country. Wine production required different skills: vineyard management, cellar work, seasonal harvest labor. The year-round employment of cattle ranching was replaced by seasonal harvest work that paid poorly and offered no security. Many former ranch hands left the valley. Some found work on cattle ranches in other parts of California. Some moved to cities looking for industrial work. They disappeared from the valley's story. The Chinese workers who carved the wine caves and built the winery infrastructure also disappeared from the narrative. By the early 1900s, Chinese exclusion laws had limited new immigration. The Chinese population in Napa declined. The workers who had hand-chiseled hundreds of feet of wine caves were not commemorated. Their labor was acknowledged in historical footnotes, if at all. The caves were attributed to the vision of the winery owners who hired them, not to the workers who spent years underground with hammers and chisels. The Native American population that had survived disease and violence faced further displacement. What little land they retained was not suitable for vineyard development. They were pushed to the margins. Their traditional food sources were destroyed by agricultural development. The controlled burns that had maintained the landscape for thousands of years were prohibited. The valley's ecosystem changed as European agriculture replaced indigenous land management. The transformation was presented as progress. Cattle ranching was primitive. Wine production was sophisticated. European agricultural techniques were superior to indigenous practices. Mexican land grants were inefficient. American property ownership was rational. The narrative justified displacement by framing it as advancement. By the 1920s, the valley's demographic composition had shifted entirely. German immigrants and their descendants dominated wine production. Italian immigrants arrived to work vineyards and establish their own small operations. Chinese workers were excluded by law. Mexican workers were limited to seasonal harvest labor. The Native American population was invisible. The original Mexican land grant families were footnotes in historical accounts. Prohibition disrupted the wine industry, but not the land ownership patterns. The families that owned estates before Prohibition owned them after. The consolidation continued. Smaller operations that could not survive Prohibition sold to larger ones. The Mondavi purchase of Charles Krug in 1943 was one example among many. Capital consolidated ownership. Each crisis eliminated another tier of small operators. The Agricultural Preserve of 1968 protected existing agriculture, but it protected wine agriculture specifically. The preserve limited development and prevented suburban sprawl from consuming vineyard land. It was celebrated as environmental protection. It was also the formalization of wine's dominance. The valley could not return to cattle ranching, even if market conditions favored it. The land was legally designated for grapes. By the 1970s, any remaining cattle operations were anomalies. Ranching was history. Wine was present and future. The valley's identity was wine country. Tourism promoted that identity. Visitors were told about wine pioneers and immigrant entrepreneurs. They were not told about drought-killed cattle herds or Depression-era distressed land sales. The complete story was too complicated for tourism marketing. The tourism industry employed thousands, but the employment was seasonal and low-wage: harvest workers, restaurant staff, hotel housekeepers. The employment that sustained the valley was service work supporting wine tourism. The wealth generated by wine tourism concentrated among property owners and business owners. The workers who made tourism function could not afford to live in the valley they worked in. They commuted from surrounding areas where housing was cheaper. This created a paradox. The valley depended on workers who could not afford to live there. The workers were essential. Their housing was elsewhere. The valley wanted their labor. It did not want their presence except during work hours. The arrangement was sustainable only because regional housing markets provided cheaper options within commuting distance. Chapter 9. The Sale Price. Before wealth became legacy, it was transaction. Land prices in Napa Valley increased consistently from 1940 through the present. In 1940, vineyard land might sell for $100 per acre. By 1960, $1,000 per acre. By 1980, $10,000 per acre. By 2000, $100,000 per acre. By 2020, $300,000 per acre or more for premium sites. The appreciation was extraordinary. An investor who bought 10 acres in 1940 for $1,000 owned land worth $3 million by 2020, a 3,000-fold return over 80 years. The appreciation was not agriculture-driven, it was scarcity-driven. The agricultural preserve limited supply. Demand increased. Prices rose. The wine business itself was profitable, but not extraordinarily so. A well-managed vineyard might generate $5,000 to $10,000 per acre annually in grape sales. A winery with strong brand recognition might double that through direct sales and tourism. But the real wealth was land appreciation. The business was agriculture. The wealth was real estate. This created incentives that favored speculation over farming. An investor could buy vineyard land, maintain minimal operations, and profit from appreciation without optimizing wine production. The land value increased regardless of wine quality. Premium pricing depended on Napa Valley designation, not necessarily superior farming or winemaking. Corporate consolidation accelerated. Constellation Brands, Treasury Wine Estates, LVMH, multinational corporations purchased Napa wineries as brand acquisitions. The wineries were absorbed into larger portfolios. The local families that had built the brands sold for tens or hundreds of millions. The sales were rational business decisions, but they transferred ownership from families who had built the businesses to corporations operating global luxury goods portfolios. Beringer was sold to Nestlé in 1971. The family that had operated the winery since 1875 sold to a Swiss food conglomerate. Nestlé operated Beringer as part of its Wine World subsidiary. In 1996, Beringer Wine Estates was spun off as a separate company. In 2000, Foster's Group purchased Beringer. In 2011, Treasury Wine Estates acquired the portfolio. The winery that Jacob and Frederick Beringer founded in 1875 had changed hands 4 times in 40 years. Charles Krug remained with the Mondavi family longer. Peter Mondavi Sr. operated the winery from 1943 until his death in 2008. His sons, Peter Jr. and Mark, continued the operation. But the scale changed. The winery that had produced thousands of cases annually in the 1860s was producing hundreds of thousands of cases by the 2000s. The brand was valuable, the history was marketable, the operation was industrial. Robert Mondavi Winery, founded in 1966, went public in 1993. The initial public offering valued the company at hundreds of millions. In 2004, Constellation Brands purchased Robert Mondavi Winery for $1.3 billion. The family retained some vineyard holdings, but sold the brand and winery operations. The winery that Robert had founded 38 years earlier as a family business became part of a portfolio that included Corona beer and Svedka vodka. The sales were presented as legacy transitions, families passing the business to capable stewards. Corporate owners promised to maintain traditions and quality. The promises were sometimes kept, sometimes not. Corporate owners optimized for profitability. That meant larger production runs, broader distribution, and price points that maximized volume. The craftsmanship that had built the brands was maintained as marketing, but not necessarily as practice. The wealth generated by these sales concentrated among the selling families, creating multi-generational wealth and hundreds of millions in liquid assets. The families that bought distressed land during economic crises in the 1970s and the 1980s realized returns their founders could not have imagined. But the returns were not distributed. The Chinese workers who carved the caves received nothing, and the Mexican seasonal workers who harvested grapes for generations received nothing. The wealth concentrated at the top. Modern Napa Valley operates on this model: corporate ownership, premium pricing, and tourism revenue. The valley markets exclusivity and heritage. Visitors pay $300 for private tastings, $500 for wine club memberships, and thousands for bottles of limited production Cabernet Sauvignon. The prices are justified by scarcity and brand recognition, but the scarcity is artificial. The agricultural preserve limits vineyard expansion, and zoning restricts new winery development. These limits protect existing operations from competition and ensure that land values and wine prices remain high. The system benefits property owners and excludes new entrants who lack capital to purchase at current prices. The valley has become what economic collapse and opportunistic acquisition created: a concentration of wealth and ownership protected by regulation and sustained by premium pricing. The transformation from cattle ranches to wine estates is complete. The beneficiaries are the descendants of those who bought distressed land a century and a half ago, while the displaced are forgotten. Chapter 10. The Tourism Machine. Before experience was a product, it was agriculture. By 2000, Napa Valley received 4 million visitors annually. By 2015, 5 million. By 2020, 5.5 million visitors spent $2.9 billion. Tourism eclipsed wine production as the primary economic driver. Wine was the attraction. Tourism was the business. The visitor experience is carefully curated. Wine train rides through vineyard landscapes, hot air balloon flights at sunrise, luxury hotels with vineyard views, Michelin-starred restaurants, and private tastings in historic cellars. These experiences are designed to create memories worth sharing on social media, and the Valley markets Instagram moments as much as wine quality. The wine itself is secondary to the experience. Visitors touring Napa wineries often cannot distinguish premium Cabernet from mid-tier alternatives in blind tastings, yet they pay premium prices because the experience validates the expense. The tasting room, the estate tour, and the sommelier explaining terroir and oak barrel aging create value that the wine alone cannot. This is intentional. Wineries train tasting room staff to create experiences that justify pricing. The staff tells stories about winery history and founding families, explains viticultural practices and winemaking techniques, and pours wines in sequences designed to lead visitors toward premium purchases. The stories emphasize heritage and craftsmanship while omitting economic history and land acquisition circumstances. The tourism model requires infrastructure that small wineries cannot afford: parking for tour buses, tasting rooms sized for groups, staff trained in hospitality, compliance with food service regulations, and capital investment in visitor facilities that generate no wine. Large corporate-owned wineries can afford these investments. Small family operations cannot. This creates competitive advantages for corporate owners who can invest in tourism infrastructure that drives direct sales. They can price wines higher because the tasting experience justifies premium pricing. They can market aggressively using global distribution networks. Small wineries struggle to compete on any dimension except wine quality, and quality alone does not drive sales in markets where brand recognition matters more than blind tasting results. The Valley's tourism success attracts visitors who drive housing costs higher. Wealthy Bay Area residents purchase vacation homes in Napa. Real estate developers build luxury residential communities. Housing prices increase. Service workers who staff the tasting rooms and restaurants cannot afford to live near their employment. They commute from Vallejo, from Fairfield, from communities where housing costs less. This creates a valley that operates on imported labor. Workers arrive in the morning, they serve wine tourists during the day, they leave in the evening. The valley's daytime population is double its nighttime population during tourist season. The workers who create the tourism experience are not part of the community they serve. They are commuters working jobs that do not pay enough to live locally. The agricultural preserve that protected the valley from suburban sprawl also limited housing development. The valley cannot build enough housing for its workforce because vineyard land is protected from residential development. The protection was necessary to prevent sprawl. It also ensured that workers would be displaced to surrounding communities. The tourism industry is celebrated as economic success. 5.5 million visitors, $2.9 billion in annual spending, thousands of jobs created. The numbers look impressive. But the jobs are service work. Tasting room associates earn $15 to $20 per hour. Restaurant servers earn minimum wage plus tips. Hotel housekeepers earn slightly above minimum wage. These jobs do not build wealth. They provide subsistence income. The wealth generated by tourism concentrates among property owners and business owners. Winery owners capture wine sales revenue and land appreciation. Hotel owners capture lodging revenue. Restaurant owners capture food sales. The workers who make the experience function capture wages that have not kept pace with housing costs. The valley markets itself as destination. But destination status depends on exclusivity. If Napa becomes accessible to middle-class tourists, premium pricing erodes. The valley must remain expensive to maintain brand positioning. This means the people who work there cannot afford to live there. The economic model requires displacement. The tourism marketing emphasizes heritage and tradition, historic wineries, founding families, generational continuity. The marketing rarely mentions that the wineries operate as subsidiaries of multinational corporations, that the wine is produced in industrial facilities processing hundreds of thousands of gallons annually, that the founding families sold decades ago. The heritage is real, the continuity is manufactured. Visitors who tour Rhine House and taste Beringer wines learn about Jacob and Frederick Beringer. They learn about Rhine Valley winemaking traditions. They learn about hand-carved aging caves. They do not learn that the property changed hands 4 times since 1971. That the winery is currently owned by Treasury Wine Estates, an Australian company that operates as a subsidiary of a larger corporate structure. The history is selectively presented to support brand positioning. This is standard practice. Every winery tour emphasizes heritage and craftsmanship. Every tasting room narrative focuses on founders and traditions. The corporate ownership and industrial production scale are minimized or omitted. The disconnect between marketed image and operational reality is intentional. The image sells wine. The reality is business. Chapter 11. The Question. Before the valley became what it is, someone decided what it would become. The transformation from cattle ranches to wine estates was not inevitable. It was the result of specific economic conditions and opportunistic decisions. Drought in the 1860s, economic depression in the 1870s, changes in fence law that made cattle ranching uneconomical, land available at distressed prices, buyers with capital acquiring property from sellers without options. The buyers were not villains. They were investors responding to market conditions. Jacob and Frederick Beringer saw opportunity and executed a business plan. Charles Krug married into property and built a successful operation. These were rational economic decisions. But rational economic decisions have consequences beyond individual success. The consequences were displacement. Mexican land-grant families lost generational holdings. Vaqueros lost employment. Native American communities lost access to remaining lands. The valley's economy transformed in ways that benefited those with capital access and excluded those without. The transformation was legal. It was economic. It was also displacement. The displaced were not compensated. Mexican land-grant families received market prices for distressed sales. But distressed market prices do not reflect fair value. They reflect desperation. A rancher selling during drought and depression receives less than land is worth during normal conditions. The sale is voluntary, only in technical legal sense. Economic circumstances eliminate real choice. This pattern repeated through multiple economic cycles. Phylloxera in the 1890s, prohibition in the 1920s. Each crisis eliminated operators without capital reserves and consolidated ownership among those with resources to survive downturns. Each consolidation was presented as natural market function. Strong operations survive, weak operations fail. The narrative omits that strength often meant capital access rather than agricultural expertise or wine quality. Modern Napa Valley operates on accumulated advantages from a century and a half of this pattern. The families and corporations that own premium vineyard land today own it because predecessors bought during crises. The land appreciation that created multi-generational wealth derived from acquisition timing, not farming skill. The wealth is real. The origin was opportunistic. Tourism celebrates the result without examining the process. Visitors tour estates and hear stories of vision and craftsmanship. They hear about immigrant entrepreneurs who built legacies. They do not hear about economic collapse that made land affordable. They do not hear about displaced ranching families. They do not hear about workers who built infrastructure and received no equity. The selective narrative serves business purposes. Complete historical accounting does not. This creates a question without easy answer. Does the wine justify the displacement? The valley produces world-class wines. The wine industry employs thousands. Tourism generates billions in economic activity. These are real benefits. But the benefits accrued to specific people at specific times. The displaced families did not benefit. The workers who build and maintain the infrastructure benefit minimally. The valley cannot return to cattle ranching. The agricultural preserve legally prevents it. The land values make ranching economically impossible. A cattle operation cannot generate returns that justify land worth $300,000 per acre. The transformation is permanent. The question is whether permanence makes the process acceptable. The valley's defenders argue that wine production is superior land use. Wine generates more economic value per acre than cattle. Wine supports more employment. Wine creates cultural value through tourism. These arguments are economically accurate. They do not address displacement of previous land users and the concentrated distribution of benefits. The valley's critics argue that the transformation benefited wealthy investors at the expense of working families. That economic crisis was exploited for land acquisition. That wealth concentrated through opportunistic buying during distressed markets. That workers who build the industry's infrastructure receive minimal benefit while property owners capture appreciation. These arguments are also accurate. Both perspectives are true simultaneously. The valley produces excellent wine and generates substantial economic value. The valley also displaced previous users and concentrated wealth among capital holders. The wine quality does not negate the displacement. The displacement does not negate the wine quality. The tension between these realities is unresolved. Modern tourism rarely acknowledges this tension. The visitor experience emphasizes heritage and quality. The economic history that created current ownership patterns is omitted from tasting room narratives. This is understandable from business perspective, but it creates a sanitized version of history that erases complexity. The Chinese workers who hand-carved the aging caves are mentioned as historical curiosity. The fact that they were paid minimal wages and excluded from subsequent prosperity is not mentioned. The Mexican seasonal workers who harvest grapes are visible during crush. The fact that they cannot afford to live in the valley they work in is not discussed in tasting rooms. The selective acknowledgement of history serves specific purposes. The valley markets itself as destination for those who can afford premium pricing. The agricultural preserve that protects vineyard land also protects exclusivity. The limited development that prevents suburban sprawl also prevents housing that service workers could afford. The valley has become economically segregated. Daytime population includes everyone who works there. Nighttime population includes only those who can afford current housing costs. This segregation is not accidental. It is the result of zoning and preservation decisions that prioritize vineyard protection over housing affordability. The decisions were necessary to prevent sprawl. They also created a valley where workers commute from elsewhere. The valley wants their labor. It does not provide housing they can afford. The arrangement is sustainable only if workers accept long commutes and limited community integration. The valley's future depends on maintaining this arrangement. If housing costs force workers to commute from greater distances, labor availability decreases. If wages increase enough to attract workers, profit margins compress. If land prices decline, property owners lose accumulated appreciation. The system requires continuation of current imbalances to function. This raises a final question. Who is Napa Valley for? The tourists who visit? The property owners who profit? The workers who make it function? The answer determines how the valley develops. If the valley is for tourists and property owners, current arrangements continue. If the valley is for workers, housing and wages must increase. If the valley is for wine quality, corporate consolidation may threaten craftsmanship. The valley cannot be for everyone equally. Economic reality requires choices. Those choices benefit some and exclude others. The beneficiaries are determined by who owns land and who makes decisions. The excluded are determined by who lacks ownership and power. This is not unique to Napa. It is how land use transformation works everywhere. But Napa's specific history makes the pattern visible. Chapter 12. The Mirror. The last chapter is not about them. It is about us. We began with a question: vision and grit, or economic opportunism during crises. The answer is both. It has always been both. Charles Krug was visionary. He recognized that California's climate could produce European-quality wines before most Americans understood wine production. He introduced techniques and varieties that established the valley's reputation. He was also opportunistic. He married into a wealthy landowning family during a period when Mexican land-grant families were selling or losing property. He acquired prime land through dowry rather than purchase. He built his operation on land someone else's family had lost. Jacob and Frederick Beringer were skilled entrepreneurs. Jacob understood winemaking at every level. Frederick understood capital and markets. Together they built an operation that survived prohibition and established a brand that lasted a century and a half. They were also buyers who purchased land at Depression-era prices from sellers who had few alternatives. The purchase was legal and market-based. The market was distorted by drought and economic collapse. The valley's transformation succeeded because it combined expertise with timing. The wine pioneers arrived when land was affordable. They had access to capital when existing owners did not. They built operations during a window when economic conditions favored displacement of previous land users. They were skilled. They were also fortunate in their timing. The Mexican land-grant families who lost their ranchos were not failures. They were ranchers who faced economic conditions that made cattle operations unsustainable. Drought they could not control. Economic depression they did not cause. Fence law changes that increased costs without increasing revenue. They sold because continuing was impossible. The buyers who purchased from them were not rescuing failing operations. They were acquiring discounted land from desperate sellers. The Chinese workers who carved the caves were skilled laborers doing dangerous work. They spent years underground with hand tools, creating infrastructure that made premium wine aging possible. They were paid minimal wages. They received no equity. They were excluded by law from citizenship and property ownership. Their labor created value that accrued entirely to property owners. The valley survived because it was never dependent on just one thing: cattle when cattle paid, wine when wine paid, tourism when tourism paid more than wine alone. The valley adapted to each economic cycle by becoming whatever generated the most return. That adaptability ensured survival. It also ensures that each transformation displaced those who could not adapt. Modern Napa exists because of this accumulated history. The wine quality is real. The tourist experience is carefully designed. The economic success is substantial, but the success rests on a foundation of opportunistic land acquisition during economic crises, displacement of previous users, and concentration of benefits among property owners. The valley markets heritage without examining how that heritage was created. The estates emphasize founding families without discussing how those families acquired land. The tourism celebrates craftsmanship without acknowledging workers who built infrastructure. The selective history serves business purposes but creates incomplete understanding. When you visit a Napa winery and tour historic caves, remember what it really represents, not just vision and craftsmanship, also Chinese laborers working underground for wages that barely sustained life. When you taste wine in a Victorian mansion, remember the mansion was built during a period when Mexican land-grant families were losing their holdings. When you pay premium prices for bottles with heritage brand names, remember the brands were built on land acquired during economic collapse. This is not to suggest that Napa wine is illegitimate or that the industry should not exist. The wine is excellent. The economic activity is substantial. But understanding how the valley transformed requires acknowledging complete history. The vision and grit are real. The displacement and exploitation are equally real. Both are part of the story. The next time you see a Napa Valley wine label, ask yourself whose story you are choosing. The story of immigrant entrepreneurs who built wine empires, or the story of Mexican ranching families who lost generational land, the story of visionary winemakers who recognized the valley's potential, or the story of Chinese laborers who built the infrastructure without sharing in the wealth, the story of premium wine quality and craftsmanship, or the story of economic crisis exploited for land acquisition. All these stories are true. We choose which one to emphasize. The wine industry emphasizes vision and quality. That choice is understandable. It is also selective. Complete understanding requires acknowledging all the stories simultaneously. The beauty of the vineyards, the excellence of the wine, the displacement that created the opportunity, the workers who built the industry without sharing in its wealth, the capital that bought land at distressed prices, the families who lost what their ancestors had built. Napa Valley is a monument to what American agriculture can achieve with expertise and capital. It is also a monument to displacement and consolidation, to economic crisis exploited for opportunity, to benefits distributed unequally, to workers excluded from the wealth they create, to selective historical memory that serves business interests. The valley continues because it has always continued, because it learned to adapt, because it never depended on just one thing. What remains is a landscape transformed. Cattle ranches became vineyards. Mexican land grants became wine estates. Agricultural workers became tourism employees. Family operations became corporate subsidiaries. The valley survived by becoming whatever each economic cycle demanded, while maintaining just enough continuity to claim heritage. This is why the story does not end with wine quality or economic success. It ends with a question about who benefits from transformation and who pays its costs. The answer determines not just Napa's future, but how we understand land use change everywhere. Who gets to decide what land becomes? Who profits when it changes? Who loses what they built? Who remembers those who were displaced? And whether we choose to acknowledge complete history or only the parts that sell wine. If you found this fascinating, hit subscribe for more stories about the hidden histories of American landscapes. Your support helps make these documentaries possible.